Set 13 is live, and they already had to B-patch it within 36 hours of launch to address two problematic compositions, Black Rose Elise and Scrap. Now, they were successful in bringing down the power level of Scrap from S tier to A tier. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful in bringing down the dominance of Black Rose. They did nerf it substantially, but it is still very strong, which leaves the meta in this odd place right now, where AP just feels like it's better than AD. They did give AD some additional options here. For example, Family Reroll is a lot better now. There's been some evidence that some different Emissary versions are quite good right now, but a lot of those are playing around AP carries. For example, Emissary Sorcerers is playing around AP. When it comes to Rebels, they buffed Rebels and brought it back into the meta, but the 4-cost carry of choice there is Zoe, which is an AP carry. You can't really play around AD until you're able to get to the Jinx. Don't get me wrong, you can put the items on Ezreal, it's just not as good. So we are in a weird spot right now where generally speaking, you should favor towards AP. There are some AD options that are available, but for the most part, AP seems to be outperforming AD. All right, the very first composition I want to talk about here is Black Rose Flex. This is the composition that was responsible for the B patch, and it's still insanely good. I'm using my new team builder here in this video. It's not quite ready yet to be public or to be used to make composition pages on my website, but this is a demo, so if you like this, this will eventually be what TFT flow looks like when you click on the various different composition links. Now, Black Rose Flex, even though it got nerfed really hard, is still one of the best comps, and it's more of a collection of compositions. So this is your standard default version that you want to play most of the time, where you play around Elise backline carry. It's still good even after the nerfs to Elise and to 5 Black Rose, and it has a natural transition from level 8 with no legendaries. You can play around this board, you still get most of your synergies active, and then as soon as you're able to get that LeBlanc, you get a huge power spike when you're able to get 5 Black Rose online. So this is, in my opinion, the best variation that you can play. The other variation that's really popular right now is Visionaries. So this is the one that was the most popular at the start of the set and then started to fall off in favor of the main variation that you see over here. And now it's coming back after they nerfed Elise. So these are roughly equal in power level. Maybe this is a little bit stronger because you get to play around Malzahar, which is arguably the best unit in the game currently. But if you have a Black Rose emblem, then you can actually just drop out of this Morgana and play Malzahar over this Morgana and then put Black Rose onto your Jace. So that would look something like this here. And this is absolutely by far the highest max cap that you can get with Black Rose other than 7 Black Rose, right? So something worth keeping in mind here is that Malzahar is a very strong unit. That's part of why the Visionary version is quite good. You also have a Sorcerer version over here. So with the Sorcerer version, there's two main ways of playing it. You can play around 6 Sorcerer or you can play around 4 Sorcerer. The max cap is better with 4 Sorcerer because if you play 6 Sorcerer, you're forced to drop out of this Mordekaiser here, which is not very good, and you're just playing much lower quality units. So in my opinion, this is the better approach, but you might find that 6 Sorcerer is a little bit easier for you to hit when you have less resources. There's also this Dominator version. I call it Cassiopeia Reroll, but it's not really Cassiopeia Reroll. You don't want to spend any time on level 7 rolling for Cassiopeia. You want to go to level 8 so that you're able to find your LeBlanc, so you're able to find your Mordekaiser. So in a lot of games, you're actually just going to be duo carrying Silco plus Cassiopeia 2. In my opinion, this is the weakest variation for playing around Black Rose, but it still has relatively good stats, especially if you are able to hit the Cassiopeia 3 on level 8. Just don't be spending gold rolling on level 7. And then the last variation here is Form Swappers. So this was the highest max cap in the last patch before the nerf, where you needed Black Rose emblem to really make this work, because if you don't have Black Rose emblem, you have to drop out of this Garen, which is just not ideal. But if you are able to get a Black Rose emblem, this is an alternative option to the main variation. For example, if you're unable to find Malzahar, but you're able to find a Jace 2 or something, this is a line that you should consider playing instead. It's roughly equivalent. They're both very similar. I would say the Malzahar version is slightly better, but 4 Form Swapper is performing extremely well right now and something worth considering. So Black Rose, still very good in the meta. Still something you're looking to play. Still a lot of different AP variations that you can play with it. When it comes to your openers here, this is the primary opener that you're looking to play around. It's the strongest one by far, where you play around 3 Black Rose, and then you can play either Cassiopeia or Morgana as your AP backliner. All right, next up we have Rebels. This is one of the two largest improvements for this particular patch. This composition went from a 4.8 all the way down to a 4.1. So it went from B tier all the way up to S tier because of the buffs that they made. The two major buffs that they made, and this might have the old notes here, which would actually be helpful for me. So yeah, the two major changes that they made is it was originally 30% of their health had to be lost before the buff came in. Now it's only 20%, and then the buff went from 4 seconds up to 5 seconds. So this is a massive change to Rebels, much stronger now. You really want to build Shojin in this composition for Zoe and Jinx just because of the fact that they get a bunch of attack speed, so that mana generation is much higher with Shojin. And you want to pair your 7 Rebels with Elise, Nami, and then if you're able to get a +1, you add Echo to the board. And that's it. It's pretty straightforward. You play your Rebel units, you drop out of Vex eventually when you have Jinx, and then you add Elise, Nami, and then Echo. There is one other variation that you can play, which is with Sentinels. So if you get the emblem +1, you can only do this if you have a Rebel +1. You can also choose to play 4 Sentinel, which enables you to play around Rumble. This might be an option for you if you get an early Rumble, and you might want to play this over this variation right here. When it comes to your openers, the two ways you can approach this is you can either go with vertical Rebel, so 5 Rebel here, or you can go with 3 Rebel and flex out some traits and play Vex as your AP backliner. All right, next up, we have the other huge gainer for this patch. This went from being like a 5.6 average composition. It was terrible, all the way up to like a 4.4 or so. And if you play around the right variations, you can do even better than that. This is actually doing relatively well right now. The big changes that they made to this is that number 1, they buffed Vi, probably one of the biggest buffs of all time. So number 1, her mana went down to 65, and also her base AD went from 40 to 50, which if you don't understand, that is absolutely colossal, probably almost never done in the entire history of TFT before. Very rare to buff a unit by this much. And then on top of that, if you look at the trait for family, they went from 15% DR, which is that little green symbol, up to 20% DR. So major changes here for family that are making it go from like an F tier composition all the way up to actually being viable now. So let's talk about a couple of things here. First of all, artifacts wise, I just want to mention real quickly here, if you're able to get Silvermere Dawn or Suspicious Trenchcoat, and I think even some of the other common really good melee artifacts are good as well. So that would be Death's Defiance, Prowler's Claw, even Spectral Cutlass looks okay. So any of those things, and you can look to play towards this. If you have a lot of copies of these units early game, you should be considering playing Family Reroll now. This is your standard 5 units that you're looking to play around. And there are 2 main variations that you can look to play. This is the old variation where you would play around Watchers and have perfect synergies. And now there's this new 4 Pit Fighter version. And the reason you would look to play around this is because your 2 primary carries are Draven and Violet. And Violet is a beast now, so being able to get this Pit Fighter online is quite good. And then eventually you want to, on level 9, move this into 6 Pit Fighter, or you can just try to 3-star everything and just play around 4 Pit Fighter. If you get a Pit Fighter +1, or an emblem here, then you could play around this absolute crazy max cap. Of course, you're not going to get here most of the time, and that's perfectly fine. The main idea is that you're looking to play around 6 Pit Fighter and then fill in the units that you see over here. Okay, so you can always just add a Tristana to your board if you need to for Emissary, or you can add a Garen to your board for Emissary. There's a number of ways you can fill this out, but this is the absolute max cap. But the big thing of note here is that if you have a lot of copies of Violet, Draven, and Darius especially, and maybe a little bit less so for Powder in particular, Powder is really not doing that well in my opinion as a primary carry. There is one other variation for Powder right now, which is you play family with Ambushers, but in my opinion it's much worse than these variations. So generally speaking, I prefer itemizing Violet and Draven and playing towards Pit Fighters, or you can play around this Watcher version if you have to play around some of the AP items. And then if you really have to, you can try playing around the Ambusher version. But as of right now, these are the 2 ways I would play family. All right, next up we have Vertical Scrap. This is by far the biggest loser of the B patch. It went from a 4.1 average all the way up to a 4.6 average. So this went from S tier to arguably like A, low A. And I suspect it'll improve a little bit over the next couple of days as it gets contested a little bit less. But here's the reality. This was the only viable AD line before the B patch. So now after the B patch, you still have Twitch, you still have this, and you have mixed AD with Rebel, but there's nothing that's pure AD that's S tier. And that's an issue in some ways because now you have such an AP-centric meta, it changes the way that carousels work. Anyway, point is, Unfortunately, this is not as strong as it used to be. This is the board that you typically would play. You'd be looking to itemize Rumble, Echo, Corki, and Gangplank. With Corki, ideally you're able to get a third full item onto him, although it's perfectly fine if you end up having to scrap this third item onto him. Definitely worth itemizing Gangplank. Very good secondary carry in the backline. Echo also does a ton of damage. When it comes to your Rumble upgrades, Tank Buster and Self-Destruct button have both been performing really well. At least I see a lot of high elo players picking those up. There's a lot of different variations here I want to show, starting off with the no legendaries board that you're going to play on level 8. So the big issue for what happened in the B patch is they took away a lot of the shields from scrap. Number one, they lowered the duration of the shield from 30 seconds down to 20 seconds. So when units get to your backline, there's a higher chance that the shield has expired. And they also reduced the amount of shielding that you got per component that you had. So this board, which was acceptable in stage 4 with the amount of shielding you had, is no longer as acceptable as it was before. So you're likely to take a lot more pressure before you're able to get Rumble. Now, if you get an early Rumble, I still think scrap is pretty good, but the major issue is that before you get that Rumble, the sustainability in those shields was a big part in what made the composition stable in stage 4, and that kind of got taken away a little bit. Now, there's a couple of options that you have here on level 8. For one, you can decide to drop out of this Tristana for a moment. You eventually want to bring it back, but you can decide to drop out of this if you need a little bit more frontline. So that could be something like Savika. If you find Savika, you could play Vi here, or you can still get Artillerist and play Urgot, who might be a slightly better meat shield for you in the front line. Plus, he provides Pit Fighter for your Gangplank if you already have him itemized. So those are some alternative ways that you can play level 8. And then once you're able to find your Rumble, you're going to replace the Ziggs with Rumble here. And then you're going to add Alawi to your board. And then you're just going to itemize whichever one of these units that you hit first as your tank. But most of the time, you're going to be prioritizing your scrap units. We have a couple of other variations I want to talk about here. So this first one is Rocket Collection. This is an augment that gives you gold collectors based on the number of rockets that your artillerists have fired out. And if you're able to get a gold collector on Corki and Gangplank, this can be incredibly strong. Another really solid variation here is Reunion. So this is the augment that gives you a Vi and an Echo and alters their abilities to benefit each other. So in this case, you're just going to replace the Alawi with Vi and make sure to try to itemize that Vi. And then the final thing I want to show here is the scrap emblem. So if you get a scrap emblem, you're going to drop out of powder, and Savika is currently the best performing unit that you can add. But if you want to be lore accurate, it's almost as good. You can actually upgrade Jinx straight to powder, and that is perfectly okay. All right, so you have an alternative option here. If you're a big Arcane fan, you could just go ahead and do this. It's perfectly fine. If you look at the stats, it's reasonably strong, but Savika is slightly better. The last thing I want to mention here are the openers. A lot of different openers that I have listed here. The big thing to understand is that playing around this 4 scrap board with powder and Ziggs generally is not that strong, so you're probably going to be better served playing one of these other variations. So a lot of these are going to have units that you're eventually going to drop, but it's better transition for you in stage 3. You're more likely to win rounds with some of these different openers than perhaps the standard scrap opener, and you should just hold on to those scrap units on bench and transition into them once you're able to hit 6 scrap. All right, next up we have Sentinel RE 2.0. This is Sentinel Heimer, the exact same name for the trait in the front line, the exact same number of them in the front line, and the exact same concept of having an AP carry in the back line with blue buff and gunblade to heal up the Sentinels. The only difference is that you're playing Heimer instead of RE, and you have an Archangel instead of a Nashers. Otherwise, it's almost identical to the set 10 composition, so if you enjoyed that comp, this is quite similar in nature. The other difference here is that you have an AD duo carry on level 9. On level 8, you're just going to drop out of the Rumble and play 6 Sentinel, and you're not going to be able to play the Corki, and that's it. It's relatively straightforward. A couple of notes here. First of all, for Heimerdinger in particular, if you're able to get the anomaly that's effectively Axiom Arc from set 8, where you get mana on every single kill, I believe it's 25 mana on kill, that particular anomaly on Heimer in this composition is completely broken. In fact, I think it might be so broken that you might want to force it. I don't know yet. I'm not saying that you should, but every time I have seen it, the person has never lost after hitting it. It's that broken. even with Heimer 1. So I believe it's called Kill Streak. I believe the anomaly is called Kill Streak. Definitely something you should keep out an eye for. It might be broken, may not be. We don't have anomaly stats right now. I've only seen a sample size of 2, but both times it won every single fight afterwards. So keep it in mind if you do see it. The other thing here is with Rumble, when it comes to upgrades, the 2 upgrades I see taken the most by high elo players are Tank Buster and then Self-Destruct button. Other than that, you can consider taking spare parts if you need to be able to push to level 9, but these 2 particular upgrades seem to almost always be worth taking. And then when it comes to your openers here, I've shown 2 different variations here. This is the, like, if you're able to hit this, you can play around this. This should be relatively easy to play around. And this is the more ideal opener that you can play around, and then just start adding Sentinels to this board. And then one last thing I want to mention is that Light Shield Crest is incredibly broken in this composition because Light Shield Crest scales with armor and MR, and Sentinels get triple the armor and MR from the trait. So the shields from Light Shield Crest are quite good. If you get this particular artifact, highly recommend playing Sentinel Heimer. There's one more variation to Heimer Sentinels that I want to briefly talk about, and that is the Singed Hero Augment, where you reroll for Singed 3 and itemize him. If you look at the stats at putting 3 items onto a Singed 3, it looks terrible, but once you exclude Chem Baron, it actually doesn't look that bad, and then once you add 6 Sentinel, it looks even better. So I don't know that this is actually good, but the stats for it actually don't look that bad if you filter for exactly this composition, which we know is a meta composition. And there is one other variation that's kind of interesting here, which is this max cap version, which I don't really know how you would get to this board, but if you look at the stats, it looks quite good. And then one other thing I want to mention here is that if you get Blighting Jewel on Hero Augment Singed, you pretty much win the game. It's completely broken. It makes sense that it would be completely broken, so something to be mindful of. Alright, next up we have Kog'Maw Reroll. This saw a slight nerf to Firelight, but otherwise is pretty much the same in the B patch. And the big thing to note about Kog'Maw Reroll is that there are a lot of different artifacts that make this composition way stronger than it otherwise would be. So when it comes to Kog'Maw, Lichbane is by far his best artifact. You can also get Wit's End, Zanya's Paradox, Gambler's Blade, and for the record, Gambler's Blade is something that you can get from Shimmer Scale Essence, which also gives you a Mogul's Mail, which is quite good on Scar. So one of the augments that's good for this composition is Shimmer Scale Essence. You can also take all that shimmers and then pick the Gambler's Blade from that, which is a little bit better than the Mogul's Mail. So a lot of different items that you can get here, a lot of different special items that you can get that make the composition a little bit stronger. The only one that's really interesting here is Lichbane because it changes the way that you want to build Kog'Maw, because you really want to pair the Lichbane with either Spear of Shojin or Blue Buff. Right now, Spear of Shojin is performing slightly better, but that might change in the future. So for now, just know that you want a mana item here, and then this last item can be Gunblade, can be Archangel, or it could be one of your attack speed items. And then when it comes to these other builds, these are usually interchangeable items, so you usually always want one Rageblade, and then you can build Archangel, you can build Gunblade, you can build Nashers, you can build Red Buff, but for the most part, you usually want to have one Rageblade plus the artifact plus one flex item, except for Zanya's. With Zanya's, you pretty much always want to pair that with double scaling. That's just always been true for Zanya's because you want those last 3 seconds of the fight to be as impactful as possible. The other thing to note here is with Scar is that Anima Visage is completely broken, as well as Innervating Locket. Both of these make the Scar able to sustain for way longer with the Gunblade healing and the healing from this item. He can just go infinite. And then lastly here, Firelight Emblem can be quite good for this composition, so another thing to keep out an eye for. On level 8, you're going to drop out of this Echo and play 6 Watcher, and then if you're able to get to level 9, which is not going to happen all that often, you'll add the Echo back in. And then when it comes to your openers here, relatively straightforward. Obviously, this is the best one if you're able to play it. Perfect synergies with 4 units, not going to happen all that often, so you can play a Darius here instead of Scar, or you can play this completely different opener and then transition it into Kog'Maw once you're able to find him. Alright, next up we have all of the different Twitch variations. There are 3 main ways that you can play around Twitch. You can play Experiments, you can play Bruisers, or you can play Snipers. So let's go through each of these. The main default way that you typically play Twitch is with Experiments, because this is the way that is most common without an emblem. So you can play this board right here. You have 3 laboratory hexes from Experiment. You put Twitch in one of them, you put Mundo in another, and then you put Urgot in the third one. And then you're looking to itemize Mundo and Twitch. Ideally get some tank items onto Elise, and then finally you want secondary carry items on Caitlyn, and that's mostly it. Getting to Caitlyn 2 is how this composition is able to go third, not first, not second. Most of the time, the best this can do is a third, unfortunately, but it is an option for you to play unconditionally, but the win rate is about 7%. So, and they also nerfed Mundo for some reason. Well, not for some reason. It was in some situations quite good, but it's weird that they nerfed Mundo and not other things. So as of right now, this is not performing that well, but it is one of the default AD lines that you can play around. The huge improvement that you can get if you get an experiment +1 is you get to drop out of Zyra and play Jace instead, and then you get to put the experiment emblem onto Elise. There's a lot of ways that this is better. So first of all, obviously upgrading a Zyra to a Jace is very good. Also, you get Form Swapper on Elise, and also, and this is really big, you're able to get a third unit that can really benefit from your experiment bonuses. So there's actually a lot of value out of getting the experiment emblem. Highly recommend playing this if you're able to get an experiment emblem, perhaps from Wandering Trainer, for example. Now we have Bruiser emblems as well. So this is where you play around 6 Bruiser and you have Twitch and Caitlyn as your backline carries. This has been performing relatively well with the Bruiser emblem going onto Mundo. Unfortunately, this got a sizable nerf in terms of the Mundo scaling with his experiment bonus, but still is quite good. The Bruiser emblem on Dr. Mundo is excellent just because his ability scales with max HP, so it makes a lot of sense. So it's still doing okay, and if you have the Bruiser emblem, you're allowed to drop out of a useless Trundle for Jace, so this is still a circumstance where you really want to have access to that emblem. And then the final situation here is Sniper emblem, where you get to play 6 Sniper with 4 Watcher, which this might look very, very familiar because this is set 11 Ashe 2.0. Okay, instead of Sniper Wardens, we're playing Sniper Watchers. That means it gets played the exact same way on level 8, by the way, where you're actually just going to drop down to 3 Watcher and still play 6 Sniper if you're able to find that Caitlyn. Being able to get to level 9, though, is a little bit different from the Ashe composition. It is way more important here because Caitlyn 2 is how this composition wins out. If you're not able to get Caitlyn 2, this is not going to be nearly as strong, but if you do get Caitlyn 2, it's completely insane, all right? So there's 3 different ways to play Twitch. You have the experiment version, Bruiser version, and Sniper version. All of them desperately want an emblem. When it comes to your openers here, you have a couple of different options. So this is leading into experiments. You could just add a couple of more experiments to this board. You can also go with this route, which is the Bruiser approach, and then you just add a Sniper to this board. And then this is the Watcher approach. I was going to say Warden because it's so similar to Warden, where you eventually go into vertical Snipers and vertical Watchers. Also, one more thing I want to note here is that Gold Collector is very good on Twitch. Best in slot would just be Rageblade Runons with Gold Collector, or you can have IE in this slot, you could have Deathblade, but Gold Collector on Twitch is quite good. All right, next up is Camille Ambushers. This is a composition I generally only recommend playing if you have a lot of copies of Camille early. And the reason for why is that there's no other 2 costs in the entire composition. So you don't actually want to spend that much time rolling on level 6. In fact, you'd rather roll on level 7 going for Smeech and Camille at the same time. But you can only really do that if you have a lot of copies of Camille before you go to level 7. So something I really recommend with this is don't play this unless you have a decent number of Camille early on, or you're able to get a good augment for this, such as Worth the Wait or Caretakers into Camille. One thing I will note is that in the past, any time there was a 2 cost that you wanted to 3-star and also push levels with, these augments have always been broken for that. And so in this particular case, this is the perfect setup for these 2 augments. So I already know without augment stats, these are excellent options. And then there's also some really strong artifacts for Camille. The 3 main ones are Prowler's Claw, Spectral Cutlass, and Silvermere Dawn. So the way you build these are usually going to be Hand of Justice plus Edge of Night, and then you add the artifact on there. The reason why Prowler's Claw and Spectral Cutlass really want Edge of Night is because in the case of Prowler's Claw, it teleports you all over the place, which means the unit's going to take aggro. And then Spectral Cutlass, same thing, you're teleporting into the enemy backline, you're going to take aggro early on. Edge of Night helps reset that. And then with Silvermere Dawn, it's a little bit different. Your Camille's not going to be teleporting all over the place, so you just want her to be a unit that's almost impossible to kill and just heals to full every single time she ults. All right, so there's a couple of artifacts that are really good for this composition. Other than that, you are looking to push levels. I do not recommend staying on level 7 after you hit Camille 3. You should just push to level 8, look for your Jinx as soon as possible, hold on to extra Smeeches, and then hopefully eventually on level 8, you're able to hit Smeech 3. For your openers here, the main opener that you're looking at over here is this Ambusher opener that's pretty solid in terms of the number of traits that it has active, but in terms of overall strength probably isn't the best unless you have that early Camille too. And then you have the other option here, which is the typical, Maddie plus Steb opener and Trundle that we've seen on several of these different compositions so far. All right, next up we have Emissary Flex. This is a composition or a set of compositions that really hasn't gotten a lot of play, but if you look at the stats, some variations are trending upward in average placement, and this might be something that becomes more popular later on in the patch as things get progressively more solved. I really can't tell yet, so I want to include it in the video here. So the first variation I'm showing here is currently the best performing. This is 4 Sorcerer with 4 Emissary and 3 Black Rose. You get a lot of different traits active on your board, and when it comes to Mbessa itemization here, there are a couple of artifacts that are really good. Prowler's Claw, Spectral Cutlass, Suspicious Trenchcoat, and Mittens are the main ones that you're looking for. And the way you build Mbessa with these artifacts is you build an Omnivamp item from this category, then you build a melee item from this category, and then you add your artifact. When it comes to her general build, if you don't have any artifacts, you're looking for an Omnivamp item. You can also get a second Omnivamp item, then you want a melee item, and you can also go for a second melee item over the second Omnivamp item. You can also go for an Omnivamp item, a melee item, and then either Deathblade, Guardbreaker, or Giant Slayer, and that's an acceptable build as well. So there's quite a few good builds for Mbessa. Don't think that you have to just get perfect best in slot, because there's a lot of flexibility here when it comes to itemizing her. And when it comes to these other variations here, you have Conqueror Emissary. So this plays around 4 Conqueror and tries to get Mordekaiser as a secondary carry, and then you get to play Jace in the backline, which is quite good. You also have Vi Emissary. In my opinion, this is the best variation if you are looking to play around the augment bronze for life, because you get 8 bronze traits active, which is completely absurd. There's no real way for us to look up the stats for this composition with this augment because they took away augment stats, but I'm willing to bet it's completely broken because, that's just so many traits, and you're already playing around something that looks viable overall. And then the final thing here is Sentinel Emissary. This is the one that's performing the worst in the stats, but I think the main situation in which you're supposed to play this is if you get a really early rumble. So if you get a rumble on like 4-1 or even earlier, then this might be the time to look to play around 4 Sentinel with 4 Emissary and see how it performs. When it comes to your openers here, this is pretty flexible. There's a lot of different options you have for your openers, so I just wanted to highlight 2 of them here, which is number 1, the Conqueror opener. I believe this is the best one, and then the other option here is some sort of Rebel opener that plays around an Artillerist in the backline, and you're really looking to aim into one of the Corki variations if you're going to play around these. The big issue with the Sorcerer variation, from what I can tell, is that unlike these variations that all have an AD backline carry, this one has an AP backline carry. So this relies on you being able to find a slightly different early game, maybe play around Nami in the early game, and that's it for Emissary Flex. Real quickly, I wanted to show a set of related compositions, which is for Conquerors. You're still playing around Mbessa primary carry, and you can still play around 4 Emissary, but you're dropping out a Twisted Fate for Darius, and then you're putting the Conqueror emblem on Jace or somebody else to get 6 Conqueror. The other option is you can play around Black Rose. So this is dropping out of the Emissary units, and you're adding LeBlanc, Elise, and Cassio to your board. And then you also have the option of playing this Vladimir if you have the Conqueror +1. Otherwise, you'd actually have to drop this Vladimir in order to play Draven to have 6 Conqueror. But I just wanted to mention this real quickly because 6 Conqueror is doing reasonably well in the stats right now. These are the 2 main options for playing it. All right, next up we have Enforcers. This is a composition that was doing incredibly well during the PBE and now is doing sort of mediocre overall. Generally would only recommend playing it if you have an Enforcer +1, and I don't even know if it's worth taking an augment for that. So something worth keeping in mind here that you really do want to have the +1 and you do want to have a decent opener with it because you really do need to get to that Caitlyn to get to that max cap here. And if you're able to get to Savika as well, that can be quite good. But generally speaking, this is a +1 Enforcer check. If you don't have that, generally do not recommend playing Enforcers. All right, next up we have Vertical Visionary. There are 2 main ways that you can play this. You can either play it with 8 Visionary on level 9 like this, or you can decide to play 5 Black Rose and 6 Visionary instead. As of right now, 8 Visionary is outperforming 5 Black Rose slightly, which is a shock to us all. But either way, they're very close together, so whichever one you have more units for, you can play around. This is something that is an alternative to the other ways that you might want to play AP, but the fact of the matter is, you're still contesting the most popular units. So in my opinion, most of the time, this is not going to be a line you lean into unless you have a really good opener in particular for Visionaries. All right, next up we have a spicy one. Quick Striker Reroll. Nobody's talking about it, and there's a reason for it. It's not good, except if you look at the stats, if you get RFC on Nocturne, the stats for that looks completely insane. But play at your own risk. I haven't seen a single soul play this. This is the board you're supposed to play, supposedly, if you're able to get this RFC Nocturne, and supposedly it's quite good. There's also some other options here. For example, if you get the Call to Chaos that gives you 3 snipers focus on 4-2, you can pivot into reroll. No, actually you have to already be playing reroll, but if you have Nocturne on your board for whatever reason, you can take Call to Chaos and know that if you're able to hit the cash out that gives you 3 snipers focus, then you probably won the game. And if you didn't, you might have lost the game. It is what it is. The last build here to consider is Prowler's Claw. This is a little bit more standard. I don't really know why you would play Nocturne with Prowler's Claw when you can just play Mbessa, but RFC is special. RFC is definitely special, something worth considering here. If you get an RFC, see how good it is on Nocturne, report back to me in the comments below. The last composition I want to talk about here is Menaces, which is only possible with this augment. When you have both Silco and Powder on the board, they alter their ability slightly, and the big thing here is that Powder gains the Dominator trait. My team builder is not set up to make that happen if you have this augment, so I had to put the emblem on here. You do not need the emblem. So you get this 6 Dominator with this exact board, you get 4 Scrap, very, very strong overall looking board. In the stats, it's pretty decent, and so this is another option if you're looking for something a little bit different that you can only play if you hit this specific augment. I hope you all found the patch guide useful. I've been working a lot on this website to build out this team builder, build out the composition pages. I have a lot of ideas for how to improve TFT flow. So if you like what you saw in this video and you want to see a website that actually has all of that information available for you, that's the goal with TFT flow. I'm slowly working there. I'm hoping that by the end of the set, it's going to look a lot better on this website and look a lot less like a hobbyist website. I think this was a big step up in that direction. Eventually, it's going to be live on the website. I'm working as quickly as I can to make that happen, but I hope this video was helpful for you. Good luck with your climb in set 13.